The narcissist is a sex chameleon. Narcissists are chameleons per se. We shapeshift into whatever is necessary, either instinctively or consciously, in order to assert control over you, to draw fuel from you, to gain character traits which continue to aid us with regard to being that chameleon, and of course, residual benefits. This shape-shifting and alteration applies to so many different things, and is all linked to character trait acquisition, something I will be referring to in a separate video. One area of the dynamic between narcissist and victim, where this chameleon-like behaviour is most prominent, is the sexual one. I cannot recommend enough that you obtain and read my book, Sex and the Narcissist, to understand all about the way that we behave sexually with you as our victims. It is eye-opening, jaw-dropping, and fascinating, and most of all, hugely informative. And I provide you with more information and detail which appertains to the sexual arena through the provision of information in this book, so do utilize it. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue whereby the sexual identity of the narcissist is a fluid concept because it has to be chameleon-like. The sexual identity of the narcissist is a fluid and interesting area. You may be familiar that our narcissism creates and maintains a construct. And this is made from the character traits that we acquire, and I will detail in a separate video more about that process of character trait acquisition. We look to acquire these traits in order, in part, to make us more attractive, interesting, beautiful, alluring, stimulating and desirable to other people. And we do this when it comes to sex. And sex is a weapon of mass seduction, and therefore our behaviour of being a chameleon is no different when it comes to the issue of sex. In the same way that we instinctively or consciously create our day-to-day identity by purloining from others, we do the same with our sexual identities. We will take a piece from other people's sexual preferences and identities in order to make ourselves more appealing to the relevant target. If we establish, through our preparatory work or an instinctive recognition, that you have a preference, for instance, for bondage in a submissive role, then we too will be happy to engage in bondage. If we learn that you enjoy having food eaten from you as you lie naked on a table, we will explain how that is one of our favourite fetishes as well. It doesn't matter whether we find it appealing or not. That is irrelevant. We do not consider whether the act is something that people would regard as normal or morally outrageous. That is not a consideration. It is something whereby we instinctively or consciously consider whether particular preference is lurking at the darker end of the spectrum. What interests us is the fact that if we are able to perform this particular act, will it allow us to assert control? Will it allow us to gain fuel? Will we obtain residual benefits from us? During the seduction stage, we select those things which you actively delight in and enjoy, so that when we do this with you, you will, of course, submit to our control and offer up the sweet, positive fuel. When our devaluation of you takes place, our lack of emotional empathy means we are not concerned whether you like omorashi, the act of finding your own or someone else's urgent need to urinate arousing. But the fuel we derive from making you drink lots of water and sit still as you need the toilet, your facial expressions and protestations, is what we are actually interested in. Control and fuel. We, consciously or instinctively, regard all of these as means to an end, and of course you will understand by now that with our kind, the end always justifies the means. We actually have no central opinion about whether the activity we engage in with you is deemed as perverse, abnormal, or generally acceptable. Of course, when dealing with other people, we may say that an activity is perverse, but that is being done as part of controlling that other individual. We may claim to be morally outraged in order to engender the agreement of the person that we're seeking to control, but in actual fact, our view is we have no actual view as to the behaviour. We only have a view as and when it suits us. And of course, dependent upon the circles within which we move, the relevant nature of our fuel matrices, and of course the relevant level of our fuel levels, what occurs is we form a particular stance. We may stick by these stances for a long period of time, governed by our narcissism. But ultimately, since the prime aims are everything, fuel is the rule, this is why we are hypocrites, why we can contradict ourselves, why we behave in a contrarian manner. So, for instance, we may maintain that, oh no, bondage is not for us, and then all of a sudden you find out with our next partner that we're tying them up regularly or being tied up by them. It all depends upon how it suits our needs to achieve that. And we do that with everything about us, including sex. If you want to be smeared in birthday cake as we sing to you before spanking you because this turns you on and makes you admire us for doing it, then, if our narcissism deems that this is the best way of asserting control over you and gaining fuel, we'll do it. Whatever you want, we will invariably do during the seduction stage, because we will just mirror your desires. All of this being fixed within the parameters of the relevant narcissist that you're dealing with. This means that some narcissists will adopt any sexual preference in order to gather fuel. Homosexuality is a trait which the narcissist will adopt. If the target is of the same sex and the use of a sexual liaison will assert control and deliver fuel to the narcissist, then homosexual activity will be engaged in. Not all of our kind will operate this way. This may be as a consequence of the particular environment we find ourselves in. If it is a predominantly a heterosexual one, then sex will be used through this heterosexual conduit. I have no interest in homosexual encounters because I operate in an especially female environment. Yes, I acknowledge that my preference for women stems from my upbringing, which is a topic for another discussion, but is worth mentioning in passing. I have no dislike for homosexuality, and I wouldn't rule it out if I absolutely had to do it for the purpose of asserting control and gaining fuel, but I've never had cause to engage in such acts. I always have alternatives available to me. Less capable narcissists, of course, don't have such a luxury of choice, and this is where you might find certain lessers who are blatantly and obviously homosexual or bisexual, and they don't care who knows. One topic, of course, which frequently picks up is about closeted homosexual behaviour by certain male narcissists, and invariably these are mid-range in nature. What happens here is the narcissist has a sexual fluidity. It is all about the control and fuel, not so much about the sex or the sexual preference, needs must, anything to keep the party going. And therefore, in those circumstances, what happens is the narcissist will take fuel from man, woman, vegetable, mineral, in effect. However, mid-range narcissists, of course, operate facades, and in such circumstances, if they were knowingly homosexual, that could cause threats to their control. For instance, they might be in a particularly conservative church-going environment where homosexuality is frowned upon or even castigated. And therefore, whilst the narcissist will readily assert control and gain fuel through homosexual behaviours and liaisons, the narcissism will endeavour to keep this hidden and shrouded as part of the facade. And that is why certain mid-range narcissists, and indeed many of them, particularly middle mid-range, are closeted homosexuals. What happens is Their narcissism says, we need to assert control over this individual. Sex is a very good way of doing it. We also need fuel. However, this individual is the same sex as us, and in such circumstances, if you were to do this in an obvious way that was identified, problems would arise. First of all, it's an act of infidelity, which would cause problems with regard to the intimate partner primary source and would derail that. Therefore, that has to be kept quiet. Moreover, it would cause particular angst and anguish because of the homosexual nature of it. Thirdly, as I've alluded to earlier, the particular environment within which this mid-range narcissist, who are of course great users of the facade, means that they will be mindful, instinctively and unconsciously, governed by the narcissism, not to do anything to disrupt their facade, to affect the fuel matrix to too great a degree by obvious acts of homosexuality. And therefore some of you will have been ensnared by narcissists that appear outwardly heterosexual, but they also have homosexual leanings, and you may have found hidden and covert behaviours in that regard appertaining to homosexuality. The best way of looking at it is that the narcissist doesn't have any sexual preference at all, that the narcissist has any sexual preference, and it is the environment and the type of narcissist that they are that chisels out the way that that functions and operates. So a lesser narcissist doesn't really care about anybody knowing what he does. However, the opportunities for homosexual liaisons are limited, so he remains heterosexual. It might be that with the lesser, the environment that he operates one is a particularly sort of macho one, and therefore homosexuality, although he doesn't intrinsically care, would of course threaten his control over appliances such as his friends if he was known to be homosexual. So the narcissism prevents him from engaging in making a choice to assert control in a homosexual way in order to preserve control over the fuel matrix as a whole. With the mid-rangers, they will operate within certain parameters, of course, the facade impacting upon that. And again, it might be that there are no opportunities for homosexual liaison, combined with the fact that it is too threatening to the facade, so there isn't even any closeted homosexual behaviour. But in other instances, there is. And that is what is behind this. The narcissists who engage in homosexual activity are often, though of course not exclusively, of a somatic nature. This is because they have such a high regard for their own physical form that seeing themselves replicated in another man proves highly attractive to them. What's happening is there is an opportunity, in effect, to have sex with himself or herself, and this proves irresistible to the narcissist, the control that's asserted and the fuel that flows from this appreciative partner being of a high amount. The narcissist, of course, will adopt the traits of others for the purpose of sexuality, and also become interested in that other person if control can be asserted and fuel is to be gathered. Sex, as a powerful tool that is available to primarily somatic and elite narcissists the most, to gather this fuel will be used. This means that a narcissist, through being a sexual chameleon, will demonstrate bisexuality, interest in transvesticism, and transgender individuals. These interests can allow the assertion of control and the gathering of fuel from the other person. Accordingly, the narcissist may develop a taste for ladyboys because they allow the assertion of control and the provision of fuel. They will cross-dress in order to prove attractive to someone who wants to provide fuel in that situation. It is also done in order to triangulate and draw additional fuel. The narcissist will delight, when devaluing a partner, in trying to shock that person, and, subject to the appropriate level of narcissism that's operating, they may do so by hinting at or revealing, indulging in such behaviours that the partner may regard as deviant. The shocked reaction on finding out that their husband is parading around the house in her panties and bra with a wig on will obviously allow the narcissist to assert control, but moreover gain fuel. Put bluntly, a narcissist will more often than not engage in sexual behaviours with anybody in any appropriate manner to assert control and gain fuel. If this means being gay for the duration of the fuel gathering, then so be it. If this requires acting in a frigid manner to frustrate the partner and gather fuel and assert control, it will happen. Should it prove necessary for the narcissist to lie on a table and be milked through a glory hole to the appreciative murmurs of the lady under the table, then the narcissist will do so. Many people are shocked when they learn of their narcissist partner's predilection for engagement in supposedly deviant behaviours. To the narcissist, they are all on the same continuum. The act itself doesn't provide any greater or lesser sexual stimulation compared to other acts, but what it might do is yield greater fuel. This is why narcissists will adopt the sexual identity of someone who engages in the more extreme elements of the sexual spectrum. It is not because the narcissist finds being dressed in a nappy and engaging in infantilism sexually arousing. It is because the ability to assert control and the fuel on offer becomes greater than the hand relief from a long-standing girlfriend. It's the fuel, the control, not the act that matters. It is the reaction of the participant and or observer which the narcissist wants, and therefore many narcissists will engage in many seemingly bizarre activities to achieve this. Acting, of course, with a lack of emotional empathy, a sense of entitlement and no accountability drives this assertion of control. Accordingly, with this knowledge, when you next find your narcissist partner wearing a horse mask and masturbating in front of a webcam with a man wearing a similar horse mask in Santiago, you may be shocked initially. But the reality is, it's actually the need to assert control and the fuel that's concerned, not the wearing of the horse mask. If you find that you have little choice but to remain with the narcissist, although I query why you should, you may eventually realise that these behaviours, although bizarre and quite possibly distasteful to you, are ultimately only about the assertion of control and gaining fuel. These behaviours are done to assert control and in order to gather fuel. Of course, there are those amongst our kind who may venture into certain activities which are illegal and unlawful. This arises out of their failure to recognise boundaries, the sense of entitlement, their lack of emotional empathy, and their ongoing quest to utilise sex to assert control and draw fuel. Those of our kind that do this have no fear of consequence which may arise from those illegal acts, as the fuel gained supersedes those concerns. You'll often find lessers in that category. Furthermore, those of our kind regard laws and conventions as inapplicable to us, by reason of our perceived superiority, and they will not regard themselves as having done anything wrong, throwing out excuses and reasons as to why they are not culpable. Others of our kind avoid illegality, because the evolved narcissism recognizes that it would disrupt the fuel matrix, disrupt control over other people, cause hindrance and shacklement, and therefore there is too much to lose. This is more the case with greater and ultra. With us, the successful edifice that we have created and that gathers us so much fuel would be lost, and we do not want that to occur. We have the higher function to recognise this, and we plan and calculate accordingly. Whilst, of course, we may leave chaos in our wake, we are mindful to ensure that our fuel platform is not damaged and remains operating at all times. The fact remains that whilst there is plenty more that I can tell you about this, and I do in the book Sex, the sexual identity of the narcissist is both ambiguous and fluid, as is required for the purposes of the assertion of control and the gathering fuel. If it moves and provides fuel, then it'll be humped. We will take on the traits and likes of the person that we wish to engage with in a sexual union, or for the purpose of controlling them and obtaining fuel. We are that sexual chameleon. The sexual activity is never vanilla and will range from the slightly unusual to the downright bizarre. But all of this will be initiated by the target. If the target enjoys having an enema administered and the pressure applied to their stomach because it arouses them, the narcissist will willingly engage in this behaviour during the seduction stage in order to assert control and gather that fuel. If the target is gay, the narcissist will be gay. If the target likes to dress as a girl and be treated like a sissy, then the narcissist will play along as a dominant school teacher. So long as control can be obtained and fuel is provided, the narcissist will oblige. The identity will also warp and shift for the purpose of gathering fuel in the devaluing process. The narcissist will engage in acts that you find alarming or hurtful in order to draw fuel and assert control over you. The sadistic elements of our kind will push the victim further and further in order to assert control and gain fuel, their mental and physical discomfort being of no concern, as we have no emotional empathy, and indeed an imperative in order for the sadistic narcissist to gain fuel from sexual humiliation, degradation, and perversion. In terms of sexual identity, we are chameleons. Narcissists are an amalgam of everybody else. There are no preferences, since for the most part we will engage in everything within certain parameters, linked, of course, to the school of narcissism and the ability to assert control through other means. By one turn, the sexual identity of the narcissist is complex and elusive, and then by another, it is obvious and ubiquitous. Understanding this chameleon-like attitude of the narcissist to adopting the sexual traits and preferences of others is key to realizing why the narcissist behaves in the sexual arena as he or she does. As ever, at the heart of this chameleon-like behaviour is the need to acquire the prime aims, chiefly control and fuel. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.